Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of April of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about Crimea, because we had more details about Ukraine attempts to attack Jankoy, the airfield in the vicinity of the city. I'll remind you that this morning the Ukrainian sources start publishing the videos of explosions on the territory of the airfield, and the Ukrainians reported in the morning of the 17th of April that as a result of the strikes that Ukrainian armed forces conducted, the Russians lost few S-300 and few S-400 systems. Later we got details from the military expert Ryber, who stated that Ukrainians used up to 12 ATACMS missiles. Most of them were brought down by the Russians, but few of them reached the target and managed to deal significant damage. And of course the Ukrainians were very happy, and they were expressing their opinions, their feelings about successful attack, but there are some Ukrainian sources who, let's say, as military summary, as other different sources, try to analyze the situation, try to analyze geolocations, satellite pictures, and many other things, trying to understand whether the explosions were and whether the Ukrainians managed to deal damage or not. And somewhere at noon time we start receiving the first geolocations, the first photos and videos giving us some information. For example, on this photo we can see the fire anomaly in the area, and now we can say approximately that, according to information we have, there were 6 explosions on the territory of the airfield. So basically we can, so more than 6, or 6, not less than 6 strikes, 6 explosions took place on the territory of the airfield. We can see at least different 6 points of fire anomalies on the area. Later we got another interesting analysis, let's say this satellite analysis, trying to understand whether there were S-300 and S-400 systems or not. And for example, on these 2 photos, satellite photos, we can see the situation that took place on the Jankoy airfield in March of 2024. For example, on this photo we can see the concentration of Russian division of air defense systems, significant number of them, and this picture was made in March of 2024. And on this photo we can see the same area on the 7th of April of 2024, so almost a month later, but 10 days ago. And for example, on this photo we can see no S-300, either S-300 or S-400 systems on the direction. So of course this photo was made on the 7th of April, and it's not let's say very smart, very good to make conclusions based on the photo that was made 10 days ago. But later other sources provided us the final confirmation, the final photo of the territory. This is not very good photo with very good quality, and this photo was made on the 15th of April, and according to this satellite photo we can make a conclusion that the Russians have redeployed and removed their air defense systems from Jankoy airfield, and after 15th of April there were no more air defense systems. So for now we can't tell for sure, and we can't confirm for 100% sure that the Ukrainians, as a result of let's say ATACMS missile strike, managed to destroy significant number of Russian air defense systems. Very likely the Ukrainians haven't destroyed even a single one. Maybe they managed to destroy some ammo depots, warehouses or something like this, but not to destroy the Russian air defense forces. From the other side, we received significant number of very interesting details from Chernihiv, the town that located to the north of Kiev. The Russians conducted from their side this morning another missile strike in the area, and as a result of a Russian strike, they managed to destroy the hotel in the area with significant number of armed forces of Ukraine soldiers inside of that building. Currently, we can't tell for sure whether the Russians managed to destroy just the regular building, just let's say the regular Ukrainian forces, or probably the foreign volunteers or something like this. But the sources reported, currently we got start receiving some updates from the, let's say, local forces, that this morning, let's say somewhere at noon time, the Ukrainians, let's say, stated about the losses of around 40 soldiers in this area, and those were already the numbers that were discovered by the Ukrainians under the ruins of the building. Very likely the losses are much bigger. For now we don't have have the exact number of losses, but that was a very powerful explosion. The sources reported that there were a meeting of the commanders of the northern Ukrainian direction, and now we understand that few more high-ranked officers of armed forces of Ukraine lost their lives. Now we are moving to Kyiv. We have very interesting report about Zelensky. As you know, the Ukrainians, Zelensky himself, is in his evening address said that Ukraine would request the convening of a meeting of the Ukraine NATO Council on the defense of the skies, the supply of air defense systems, relevant systems and missiles. That was his statement that he made yesterday in the evening. And today we got confirmation from the Stoltenberg, from the NATO, that NATO will convene a meeting of the Ukraine NATO Council on April 19th with the participation of Zelensky Stoltenberg. This is a very important statement. From one side, you might say that Zelensky just tried to get and to receive additional air defense system, so that's why this meeting is going to take place. But this is the pattern. This is the pattern, and Ukraine and the Western countries usually act like this when the situation is critical and very dangerous, first of all in Ukraine. Usually, when there are very high risks of Russian missile strikes, of Russian Kinzhal strikes, of Russian, let's say, some big activity of air forces and maybe some, special operation from the Russian side, usually the Western countries try to take out Zelensky from Ukraine in some safe direction, let's say in Brussels or to Washington or to France. So they're moving. So the Western countries try to remove Zelensky from Ukraine and to send him in a tour all over the entire world. He have some meetings in Poland, Berlin, Paris, London, and so on. And after the Russians finished this or that operation, missile strikes or some special operation, then usually the Western countries return back Zelensky. So I'm not saying that Zelensky is not going to receive some air defense systems. Maybe he will receive some system from Germany or something like this. But once again, the main purpose of this meeting is to remove Zelensky from Ukraine during the very difficult period during the next few days. Because I'll remind you, and once again, I'm not saying that the Ukrainians haven't destroyed the air defense systems. Very likely the upcoming night the Ukrainians will make more attempts to attack Crimea and even Crimean bridge, and which will force the Russians to start massive attack on the territory of Ukraine. The Ukrainians maybe are trying to destroy Crimean bridge, and in this case, of course, it is very dangerous to continue keeping Zelensky inside of Ukraine. It's better on this period of time to remove it. So as I understand, this is exactly what is happening in Ukraine. Now let's move to the situation on the ground. First, we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction. Just few updates from the territory. The Russians managed to discover and to destroy another Ukrainian multiple launch rocket system, Vampire, on the direction. And this is very important because probably if we calculate the number of Vampires that have been destroyed since the beginning of, let's say, March, the number of the destroyed systems is more than 20, probably more or less, plus minus. And now we see, have you mentioned, I would like to point your attention that during the previous few days, during the previous weeks, we see the complete reduce of Ukraine attempts to attack Belgrade with multiple launch rocket systems. And probably the main reason of that is that Ukrainians have already lost the most of this weapon. Now we are moving to line of combat contact. The northern Kupiansk direction, we haven't received anything. Southern Kupiansk direction, we haven't received anything as well. So as you can see, the front line was completely stabilized. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians conducted any attempts to attack each other. Siversk direction, as you can see, based on the geolocations and icons, we see significant activity from the Russian forces. The Russians continue clearing the Belogorovka itself with multiple launch rocket systems, but without any attempts to attack the village on the ground. The terrain is very difficult. It's very difficult to attack in direction of the hills. So that's why the Russians are just bombing and attacking this territory. Very interesting details are coming from Verkhneykamyansk. Today the Russian sources published additional video of how they were bombing and attacking Verkhneykamyansk with FABs. A few more explosions. I remind you that the central part of Verkhneykamyansk is most fortified, and now the Russians are trying to reduce the defense of Ukrainians. If we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of months, we would see that there is a very big activity of the Russian forces on this direction. So very likely that the Russians, after a few attempts to storm Bilogorovka, and after most of those storms were repelled by the Ukrainians, the Russians decided to change their plans on the direction. Currently, the Russians are trying to focus their activity on Verkhnyokamyanskaya direction with the purpose to establish complete control over the village, because as I understand now, the Russians realize that to capture Verkhnyokamyanskaya is much more easier for them than to establish control over Bilogorovka. If the Russians are able to establish control over Verkhnyokamyanskaya, this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense belt and to force the Ukrainians to fall back from Bilogorovka itself. So maybe this is the new Russian plan that they will try to implement during the next few days. We see a certain Russian activities along the railways. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces along the railways from Bilogorovka to Vyimka. This is another artillery preparation with the purpose to clear the territory before the further ground operation. During the next few days, we expect some certain Russian activity or few more attempts to establish control over additional trenches on the fortifications. Chasiv Yar. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received lots of updates. The important thing is that the Ukrainians reported that the 3rd Azov Brigade refused to go to Chasiv Yar to, let's say, as a rescue team for stabilization of the front line. I'll remind you that just during this year, Syrsky sent 3rd Azov Brigade to Avdiivka, where they had significant losses, but probably they managed to help the Ukrainians inside of Avdiivka to evacuate. Then Syrsky sent 3rd Azov Brigade to Krasnogorovka, and they managed to stabilize the situation there as well. And now Syrsky decided to send them to Chasiv Yar, but this time the Azov Brigade refused to follow the order, at least according to rumors. The Ukrainians, the front line in Bilogorovka was stabilized as well. The Ukrainians during the previous few days tried to counterattack the Russians for a few times. And on this video, for example, we can see another Ukrainian T-64 tank that was trying to move to Kalinovka, but was damaged by a Russian anti-tank missile, and after that the tank moved and sank in the small lake. So this is the situation in the area. We have received no updates from the central or the eastern part of Canal, just a regular FPV drone activity, FPV drone clearing, bombing, and that's it. Nothing special, no progress on the ground, nothing like that. We still haven't received any updates confirming the Russian control over this territory let's say in the vicinity of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. So due to complete absence of additional geolocations and confirmations, we will return back the color of armed forces of Ukraine control over the territory during the next 24 hours. So we will return back the, let's say, Ukraine positions there. Now we are moving to Klishchiivka area. We can see a certain activity of the Russian armed forces. The Russians during the previous 24 hours were bombing the Ukrainian positions, were attacking Ukrainians with FPV drones, and we see that activity is very big. And I'll remind you that just a few days ago we received a video from the Russian side of how their drone was flying above the territory, and how the Russian drone was dropping the applications suggesting the Ukrainians in the town to surrender. So after, let's say, that ultimatum, the Russians launched an offensive first phase with, let's say, FPV drones clearing and artillery preparation. So all these things, all these activities tell us that very likely during the next few days the Russians will start the clearing operation of Klishchiivka itself. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area. As we discussed in the previous morning update, we have significant progress from the Russian forces that was geolocated by the, let's say, pro-Ukraine mappers deep state, and according to pro-Ukrainian mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the residential area that located between the railways, and furthermore the Russians managed to enter Ocheretina itself. So we can say that the 17th of April is the official date of the beginning of the battle for Ocheretina. Furthermore, we have very interesting and very important, let's say, photo, another satellite photo from Ocheretina, and on this satellite photo we can see very heavy clashes exactly on the southern part of the village. We see lots of significant number of fire anomalies in the central, northern and the southern parts, which confirms additional Russian progress and that the Russians are storming this area heavily. This is very, for Ukrainians, it's very difficult to protect the southern part as soon as the Russians Russians entered, because the only safe road for the Ukrainians to redeploy forces is along this line, Pershatravneva Street. Then the Ukrainians need to cross the railways, and then from this side they can send additional reinforcement. This is not very good and not so easy, so that's why I have no doubts that within the next few days the Russians will be able to establish complete control over the southern part of Cheretsina, and this situation will lead to complete collapse of the Ukrainian defense belt in Solovyovo, Novobakhmutovka. I'll remind you that the Russians have almost established control over the first defense belt that goes through Berdichi, Semenovka, Umanska, Yasnobrodovka, Nitailova. The Russians have almost captured Berdichi as well, and now the Russians already launched the battle for the next defense belt, and this is Ocheretin, Novobakhmutovka, Solovyovo, Novopokrovska, Novoselovka I, Mizhova, and Karlovka water reservoir. And based on the geolocations and this update about further Russian progress in the vicinity of Ocheretin, we can say that the Russians have already cut the second defense belt in two parts, and now the northern part lives completely separate life from the southern defense belt. So we can say that the second defense belt was penetrated by the Russians, and now the Ukrainians need to start thinking how to stop the Russians on the third defense belt, and probably currently nobody knows where exactly the third defense belt goes, if there is a third defense belt at all. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Pervomaiska. As we discussed during the previous 24 hours, some mappers have updated their maps showing additional Russian progress to the south of Pervomaiska, yet we haven't received any additional details about further Russian progress, whether the Russians managed to establish control over this artillery pocket or not. Very likely there are currently negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, who were left by the Ukrainian commanders inside of the artillery pocket, and the Russians probably suggest the Ukrainians to surrender. So very likely I expect that during the next 48 hours this artillery pocket will be captured by the Russians and the Ukrainians will surrender. Now we are moving to Krasnogorovka. As we discussed during the previous 24 hours, the Russians conducted significant number of attempts to attack the central part, and the Russians were pretty successful. A lot of mappers have already updated their maps showing additional Russian progress in this area, and according to different mappers, this territory is already under Russian control. And this evening we start receiving updates from the Russian sources that the Russians launched the assault operation on the, let's say, industrial zone in the central part itself, and according to information we have, the Russians have already entered the industrial area, and that the clashes currently are taking place in this part of Krasnogorovka, so inside of the main Ukrainian defense belt. And I'll remind you that if the Russians are able to establish control over the main defense belt of the armed forces of Ukraine and Krasnogorovka, this situation will lead to complete collapse of the stronghold, and it will force the Ukrainians to start withdrawing their positions from the eastern part of Krasnogorovka to the western part, so the Ukrainians would be able to stay as close as possible to the main evacuation and supply roads. So the situation is collapsing, and obviously there are very high chances that the Russians can establish complete control over, or at least to establish control over, more than 50-60% of Krasnogorovka before the end of May. During the previous 24 hours, the main Russian artillery focus was established on the main supply roads between central part of Krasnogorovka industrial zone, where the Russians are currently trying to storm the area, and the eastern part of high-rise building. So the Russians very likely tried to cut the area in two parts and not to allow the Ukrainians' reinforcements to be sent from one side to another. So the battle for Krasnogorovka is coming to an end. There are still a lot of things to do, but we see that the progress, every day we see additional progress, and the critical situation is getting faster and faster. When talking about South Donetsk direction, we haven't received anything, let's say, important, just a video from the Ukrainian sources of another Russian attempt to attack from Solovyovo in direction of Vodyane. The Russians were using significant number of armored vehicles, but the Ukrainians stopped the Russian attack with the use of FPV drones, and most of armored vehicles of Russian forces were destroyed, and the Russians were forced to fall back. The Russians continued destroying and reducing to ruins Ugledar itself with significant number of aviation bombs, but without any attempts to storm the area and to start any offensive on the ground. When talking about Remivka tactical bridgehead, after a very active phase of offensive during the previous few weeks, the Russians decided to launch a small operational pause. Probably after a few days of a small pause, the Russians will renew their offensives. Zaporozhye area, we have a lot of very interesting details. Probably these days, there were, let's say, something like rotation period of time when the Ukrainians were trying to remove exhausted forces from Robotyne itself and to replace them with the fresh forces from Orekhov. So that's why the Russians, of course, knew about possible rotation. So that's why the Russians established complete control, fire, FPV drone control over the fields between Orekhov and Robotyne. And the Ukrainians just during the previous 24 hours lost significant number of artillery systems, armored vehicles, and light vehicles that Ukrainians were using for that process, but without any changes on the ground. The clashes is ongoing. So as you can see, the situation is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians, and very likely during the next few days we're going to see some big changes on the ground, and the changes probably will appear on Krasnogorovka, on Ocheretino, probably on South Donetsk directions, and Belogorovka as well. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, share my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.